In this video, I'll be describing in a bit more detail the Stigma Buster project that you will be working on throughout the semester. I chose to include this image here of our football team from a couple of years ago. They did a project, not initiated out of my class, but it is a great example of a Stigma Buster project that many of the athletic teams participated in that year, where on social media they posted themselves showing OK sign, and the campaign was about being able to say it's okay not to be okay, which was a mental health promotion event. So I want to give you an overview, some more examples, a little bit of theoretical background, but I promise not too much of that, so that you can get your head fully around the Stigma Buster project. And I look forward to talking with each of you in our individual meetings coming up in the next couple weeks. So just to remind us all of what we mean by stigma. Stigma, as I introduced it in the orienting lecture at the beginning of the semester, is caused when people have attitudes and beliefs that justify rejecting certain classes of people based on their status as members of various social groups. And I talked in that orienting lecture about how mental illness stigma functions in our culture and the negative impacts it has for people who have mental illnesses, but for all of us as a culture. Now, I encourage you in the module on the Stigma Buster Project, I've encouraged you to read or skim through a document that I uploaded to D2L called Challenging Stereotypes. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of quotes from that document because I think it sets a good, gives you a good background for what I really intend as you embark on this project. The first quote that they provide, that I want to provide for you, is this idea that prejudice, stigmatization, and discrimination are deeply embedded in our language, our beliefs, in how we interact with one another. And then there's this reminder by these authors that mental illness is only one part of an individual's entire experience, but we tend to refer to it as the whole person. And that's one of the major goals of the Stigma Buster Project as a whole. And I also like this quote from former Surgeon General David Satcher, who embarked, he was one of the first Surgeon Generals of the United States to really embark on a clear campaign for mental health awareness and stigma reduction. He argued at the time that as a culture, we've permitted stigma to exist, and because we have permitted stigma to exist and even propagated it through media, that it encourages this, as he put it, unwarranted sense of hopelessness about opportunities for recovery for people with mental illness. And that exacerbates the barriers that people face as they try to recover, as they try to find treatment, as their families struggle to support them. And as he argued at the time, it's time to take them down. So we continue to struggle with that. As you know, the Challenging Stereotypes document that I provided for you was authored in 2001. The situation has not changed a great deal, other than the fact that in the social media kind of universe, we do have more public displays of people who have mental illnesses who are talking about their experiences. What remains challenging, however, is that we still have a tremendous amount of very deeply ingrained negative messaging and negative beliefs and attitudes that continue to keep stigma quite active. I also provided some documents for you to think about as you start coming up with ideas. There are lots of different kinds of stigma. And Corrigan and his colleagues working out of his lab, have classified 3 different types of stigma. Public stigma is what we've been talking about in this class mostly at this point in time. That's attitudes and feelings expressed by people at large, so the general public, about people with mental health problems, and also by extension their family members. So what we're talking about primarily as evidence of public stigma is surveys and questionnaires, perhaps even interview research or focus groups. But with public stigma, you're talking about global attitudes that are embraced by a particular culture or subgroups within that culture. But there's also institutional stigma, and that's where, ingrained in the public institutions that make up a culture, there are policies, procedures, habits, even, that support stigmatizing attitudes and beliefs. So institutional stigma, just like you've probably learned a great deal about institutional racism in the last few months, if you didn't already know about it, institutional stigma toward mental illness means that there are social structures in place that exacerbate or build on these negative attitudes and beliefs about mental illness. So you end up with the stigmatizing attitudes and beliefs, and then the behaviors that follow them that may be parts of public stigma being reflected in policies such as housing practices, loan practices, educational policies and practices. So the organizations that make up a given culture and the social systems within it may actually have policies and procedures that are consistent with the public stigma within that culture. Concrete example, in healthcare in the United States, which is a hot mess in the general sense, but when you look at insurance policies, they do not, even though there has been some legislative effort to correct this, mental health conditions are not covered in the same way that other kinds of illnesses are covered. So, for example, if I were to be diagnosed with cancer, my coverage for the treatments would, go for as long as the treatment lasted, up to a very high dollar value maximum on my policy. For mental health, however, my workplace provided insurance covers, I believe it's still 10 visits to a counselor in a calendar year. So you can see the problem there. That's an example of institutional stigma. And then there's also self-stigma. So this happens when people internalize the elements of public stigma and see themselves as being deficient, see themselves as being less. So when people internalize these disrespectful images, they start to see themselves as not having the right to be fully engaged, fully valued members of their communities. So in your thinking about your Stigma Buster project, you can work within any of these domains in terms of the project that you design, or you can work within more than one of them, depending on what you choose to do. Now, Corrigan and Watson, they also lay this out. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but it's provided for you just so you can clarify your thinking about what you might want to do in your project. You can also look on the left-hand side of this table. You have these elements of prejudice and discrimination. And in my opening lecture on stigma as a social problem, I talked about how we categorize things, we develop stereotypes. From a public stigma point of view, those are the negative beliefs about a particular group. And for mental illness stigma, you're talking about beliefs like dangerousness, incompetence, and so on. On the institutional side, you may have negative beliefs about that group, and then they're taken into the policy zone. So if the stereotype of people with mental illness is that they're dangerous, or that they have weak character, or they're likely to be incompetent, that means that hiring decisions are going to be based on that perception, and people with a mental health history may be avoided systematically from inclusion. And then on the self-stigma side, those stereotypes can become internalized, so that a person with a mental illness diagnosis could come to see themselves as weak or incompetent or incapable. Prejudice is a specific set of attitudes, and in some cases, my social psych background, we sometimes talk about prejudice as a negative attitude, so a negative feeling. And Corrigan and Watson, they talk about it as agreement with a belief and or a negative emotional reaction. And they're combining a couple of things there. So on the public stigma side, prejudice ends up expressing itself as, say, you may have a stereotype about people with mental illness, and in your voicing of those opinions, you express agreement with others who share the same beliefs, and you also have the added component of these negative emotional responses. So when you have a negative prejudicial attitude towards a particular group, in this case people with mental illness, that would come associated with emotions such as disgust, anger, and fear, as opposed to more positive feelings associated with empathy. On the institutional side, these negative attitudes, which may be connected to very specific, memorable negative examples of the stereotyped group, these negative attitudes and emotional responses become kind of embedded in the culture of organizations. So, for example, in a corporation, if there's a belief that people who have a history of psychological problems are likely to damage the organization in violent and disruptive ways, and I've seen this happen in some organizations. If a person comes forward and it's noted that in their human resources department that they've sought treatment for a psychological problem or for an addiction, in some cases, organizations have been found to demote or even fire individuals who sought out that kind of assistance. Now, since that time when organizations through their HR departments would find out such information, privacy laws have been put into place that says that it's illegal to do that kind of retaliatory firing. Still though, if say an employee informs their supervisor that they're seeing a psychiatrist, or they're going to counseling, or they're in treatment for a substance abuse problem, there still are cases where, especially in states like Ohio, where you can fire people without having to prove that they're being fired because they can't do their jobs. You can be fired just because the company wants to fire you. So that's an example of how you can have institutional stigma in this prejudice domain. And then on the self-stigma side, very consistent with what we saw above with stereotypes, you can self-label prejudice, meaning you not only believe the stereotype and you've internalized it, but you have self-hatred that's associated with it. So it has that negative emotional valence that, as Corrigan and Watson put it, is correlated with low self-esteem, low perceptions of the ability to be effective in one's world. And then finally, on the discrimination side, and discrimination is a behavior. It's a behavioral response that is most likely tethered to prejudiced attitudes and stereotypical beliefs. So the public stigma, in the public stigma zone, you have people who respond to their own prejudicial attitudes by avoiding others, by withholding employment opportunities, by restricting housing, by restricting educational access, for example. Just a quick example, if let's say that you have very negative attitudes towards people on the autism spectrum, for whatever reason, you may, because you find these are people that you dislike, that you find them irritating, that you find them incompetent, and you discriminate by not being friends with them, not wanting to sit with them, not wanting to partner with them on projects, and so on. On the institutional side, sticking with my example of people with autism, if a university, for example, thought, and the Americans with Disabilities Act has pretty much corrected parts of this problem, that people with autism are inappropriate for a college environment, that they can't be successful, and that their needs can't be met, then they would not accept them as students at their institution. And there were a number of lawsuits, in some cases class actions, that went against educational institutions who simply said no to people on the spectrum. Now, as I said, the Americans with Disabilities Act has given individuals with mental illnesses a bigger club to swing to demand that they get accommodations in their education so that they can pursue a higher education just like other people can. On the self-stigma front, if a person has internalized the negative beliefs and the negative attitudes and emotional reactions of their surrounding culture, they may in fact self-handicap. And that's something that's been found in research by Corrigan and others, where if people have high levels of internalized self-stigma, they actually may be found to hamstring themselves in terms of trying to seek better employment, trying to pursue education and other kinds of opportunities. And they may, restrict themselves even further from social interactions. Another framework that I really like, and I've uploaded some documents that go along with this, is a framework by Dr. Fiona Warner-Gale called the Tackling Stigma Framework. And in this framework, and I'm only presenting it to you here not because I expect you to design a giant framework project like this, but I want to give you a holistic look about what the possibilities are. Dr. Warner-Gale argues that what's required, if we're going to really reduce stigma and move the needle on mental health attitudes, is that you have to have multiple projects that are mainstreamed and integrated with one another. Now, I try to do a mini version of that with the Stigma Buster projects that are conducted within my class. Because what you're really trying to do is push a bunch of different projects that have a shared conceptualization of what the problem is. That we have stigma against people with mental health conditions. And as Warner-Gale suggests, if we share a common language and a common point of view about this, we can have multiple projects that are all pushing the same kind of agenda. These programs can include informational pieces like pamphlets, flyers, and websites, and those are really popular kinds of projects among my students in PSY 300. But you can also have more, you can also have other kinds of approaches that involve art, that involve other kinds of creative endeavors, and also discussions of services and practices that can be presented in a destigmatizing way, such as, you could have pamphlets, flyers, websites, and such that provide information about specific mental health conditions, or you can have those same kinds of approaches that involve presenting, getting counseling, or seeking help and assistance in a destigmatizing way. There are also education and training programs that can teach people to be more mindful about stigma. I've had lots of students over the years who have created kind of little training modules for their peers. I've had some students do that in athletic training, in education, and I believe I had a student who did that from the nursing perspective as well. What these projects kind of have in common is that they have the goal of communicating and doing what we call outreach, which is you, the student, are going to reach out beyond just your immediate circle to educate a broader audience beyond you. The goal is to create more effective systems. Now, Warner Gale is certainly talking about how do we use a tackling stigma framework within an existing mental health organization or a governmental organization. I want you to think about creating the effective system and more accessible services from the point of view of the college culture or your hometown culture, for example. One thing that Warner Gale emphasizes is that you can actually make the media, even if you're criticizing media products, you can make the media an ally by contacting media opinion leaders, by reaching out to reporters, by really using in smart and creative ways the world of social media. You can also emphasize the idea that fighting stigma is an element of good citizenship. So when you pull more and more people in, and many times students who are working on their Stigma Buster projects, they make it a part of a group that they already belong to. And they kind of loop in their other group members as partners in their effort to reduce stigma. So for example, I've had lots of athletes who do their project with their team, or members of Greek organizations who do their project with their brothers and sisters in their house. Still others have done programs with their department, with other majors, and stuff like that. And I've had a handful who've taken their Stigma Buster projects back home with their church or with another organization that they work with. I've had a couple who've taken it to their workplace and made their workplace the environment in which they tried to engage greater participation from others that they could involve as partners in their efforts at stigma busting. Now, as it states in your syllabus and on the module for the Stigma Buster project, I have for a long time used this statement from the National Alliance on Mental Illness that had for a long time this Stigma Buster Project page within their national website. They no longer do that, but I still like the statement that they originally used. So the goal of these projects is to fight inaccurate, hurtful representations of mental illness. And that's regardless of where these representations are found is in television, film, print, other media. What you're doing is educating yourself, being smarter about what mental illness is, what specific mental illnesses are like, and then being equipped to challenge stereotypes effectively and to educate others, whatever group you've decided to target in your Stigma Buster project. The last part of this statement, the NAMI statement, I really like a lot because, you know, one of the really important aspects of doing Stigma Buster projects is that you are honoring the courageous challenges that are faced by people with mental illness and their families each and every day. If you've been following the news, the reports of the death of a young man in Rochester, New York, who his family had called police for help because their loved one was ill, was behaving in a way that was consistent, according to media reports, with someone who is experiencing symptoms of a mental illness. And unfortunately, decisions were made that were inconsistent with de-escalation and um, uh, the safe hospitalization of a person who was struggling with a mental health problem. And instead, a bag was put over his head and he stopped breathing. It's that kind of real life situation that says to me that I need to continue doing this work. So you can keep kind of events like that in your mind as you're thinking about what you might want to do. As it says in the syllabus and in the D2L module for the Stigma Buster projects, the overarching purpose of these projects is for you to educate the campus and or the wider community concerning mental illness and its treatment. I want you to be able to communicate to whatever audience you choose something about the degree of misinformation. So something about the way in which people with mental illness are, the way in which our culture tends to conceptualize who these people are. So when you construct your project, you're going to be making it clear to your audience that you are fighting stigma and identifying what stigma is and being able to communicate in an educational way how you are combating that for them. Ultimately, what you're going to be doing with these projects is encouraging members of the campus community, or if you are targeting an off-campus population, whatever that population is, you're encouraging the members of those communities to become more accurate and to develop more mindful perceptions of people with mental illnesses. Evaluation, and again, this information is available to you in the Stigma Buster Project module on D2L. I have a rubric that I use typically for all of my projects. The first area that you'll be evaluated in is the ideas and content that you've used to construct your Stigma Buster project. So let's say, for example, you've decided that you want to challenge the stigma associated with schizophrenia. You're going to need to do some research, find resources that you can use to confront some of the negative beliefs, like, say, for example, the misperception that schizophrenia is the same thing as multiple personalities, or the misperception that people with schizophrenia are significantly more likely to be violent and dangerous than people without schizophrenia. So you have to research and build a base of knowledge that you are then going to share in your Stigma Buster project. Since you will be writing an essay for me, and you will be producing some kind of product for your Stigma Buster, I do evaluate, the technical competency of what you've produced. So the essay that you write, I will be evaluating your writing. Any product that you produce, if you create a pamphlet or a poster, the technical components, is it clear language? Are there spelling errors? Are there grammatical errors or errors in design that make the product less effective in terms of how impactful it is? So there will be that. And also you have to have a well-researched project. So going back to the idea of ideas and content, depending on what you choose, you will need to do your homework, do your research to make sure that the ideas and content that you intend to share with other people is actually coming from valid and reliable sources. So your research has to include a minimum of 5 references. They do not have to be peer-reviewed journal articles. In fact, those are not particularly useful for these projects. Instead, and I've provided you in the resources page in D2L with lots of links to national organizations that can give you just tons of valid and reliable information. So when you're selecting these sources to use as references to build your project, what you're looking for is the reliability of the source and the quality of the information that they are providing you. Don't just give me a list of, you don't just jump onto the databases and get me 5 research articles that have been published recently on depression treatment. That's not going to be helpful in terms of you being able to communicate effectively with a large audience about these issues. So instead, what's more helpful is for you to find either web-based sources from national organizations that host very reliable, useful information, or to go to textbooks of various kinds to get the right kind of information to share. If you're looking at presenting information about a specific diagnostic category, for example, the 2 textbooks that I provided links to, the ebook copies in our library system, can be very helpful for you. But also that resource list where I give you a whole bunch of websites that you can go to that are really solid sources of information. That's something that you want to go to. What you are not permitted to use, and I will be very rigid about this, you're not to use blogs, and that includes blogs that are posted within Psychology Today, for example, or Psych Central. There will be some cases in which I will permit Psych Central and Psychology Today bloggers, but typically I will not. Comment boards are an absolute no. Editorials from newspapers are a no because they're opinion pieces. Wikipedia is an absolute hard no, as is, Yahoo Answers or Answers.com. Even, sometimes students want to give me as a reference a Medline abstract. Abstracts are not a reference. Abstracts are abstracts. They are not a resource. You can't use that as a reference. You have to get the entire article as opposed to just a reference. Some students are tempted to use Google Scholar as a way of finding their sources. There's nothing inherently wrong with Google Scholar, but it tends to give you, in its hundreds of hits, the most popularly used, the most heavily cited research articles associated with a topic that you're researching. And as I said before, peer-reviewed journal articles on a given disorder or something like that are not likely to be your best source of information for this particular project. And I can talk to each of you one-on-one as you're starting to explore your ideas more about how to make good decisions about sources. So what are you going to turn in for me? There needs to be some kind of version of a finished product. I give you the example, and this, I should really update this. When I first started teaching this class in 2004, I had some media majors who created television and radio public service announcements. And that was an antiquated time. They actually handed me cassette tapes of their products. Now what people tend to turn in is a web link. If they made a public service announcement in the form of video, they gave me a YouTube link or an MP3 version of the video. If they were doing a radio piece, they sent me an audio clip that they were able to turn in. If they weren't able to do that, they gave me a transcript of what was said. If you develop, for example, a Hall program, I've had lots of students in the past who are RDs or RAs. I assume that's still what they're called. They sometimes did bulletin boards or a program that everybody was required to come to a certain number of. What I ask is that you give me a copy of the materials that you use for creating the program and for assessing its effectiveness, as is described in the assignment sheet. Um, there, there are other, types of projects. If you designed a pamphlet, I want the pamphlet. If you designed a poster, I want a photograph of the poster. If you did a bulletin board on campus, I want a really good uh, uh, photograph or several photographs of that bulletin board, and so on. If you do a piece of art, I want some way of you being able to show it to me remotely. So in whatever way you can manage it, I need to be able to evaluate the finished product. You're also going to turn in a reflection essay. These generally are, and I say 2-page, not including a title page or the reference page, but two pages of writing where you talk about how you thought up the project, how you designed it, and then what happened with it. These essays are made up of some pretty straightforward components: an introduction describing the project, explaining why you wanted to complete it, some kind of articulation of what your goals were for the project, a description of what kind of steps were involved. And sometimes there's 1 or 2 steps. Other times there are quite a few, depending on the nature of your project. And then a summary of what happened, what kind of outcome or impact you think the project had. And then finally, you're going to include a reference page in APA format to document your source material. So that's what you'll turn in for evaluation. Now, hopefully that gives you some more information. Of course, when you have your individual or group meetings with me over the next couple of weeks, make sure that you ask questions and be creative. I always encourage students to work within their own particular wheelhouse. One of the things I love about this class is that I have students from every kind of major. And what I encourage you to do is think about things that you actually care about, whether it's from your own personal experience, the personal experiences of people you care about, or it's career related. It's something connected to your major or your future career interests, or it's just a hobby or a talent that you have. I've had people do very, very creative projects. So I don't want you to limit yourself to, I'm just going to make a pamphlet about depression. And there's nothing wrong with that. But don't necessarily foreclose yourself to the most obvious example of what you might be able to do. Allow yourself some freedom to think about what you care about, what you're interested in, and the kinds of things that you're just good at, as we start to have this conversation about what you want to do.